You have been told that courage means the absence of fear. The Stoics said the opposite, and they built an entire philosophical practice around the assumption that fear would always be present, that it could never be fully removed, and that the goal was never to extinguish it but to understand it with enough precision that it could no longer govern you without your consent. This distinction is not a minor adjustment in framing. It fundamentally alters what you believe you are supposed to do when fear arrives, whether it is fear of failure, of loss, of death, of humiliation, or simply of the unnamed dread that settles in before a difficult day. The Stoics did not flinch from that dread. They examined it. They had a method, and that method was both rigorous and practical. In this video, we will examine 4 specific things the Stoics did when they felt afraid, drawn directly from the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the letters of Seneca, and the discourses of Epictetus. If the Stoics' approach resonates with you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. What makes this tradition worth examining today is not that it is ancient, but that it was forged under genuine pressure. Epictetus wrote as a man who had been enslaved. Marcus Aurelius wrote while commanding Roman legions on the Danube frontier and watching his children die. Seneca wrote facing political exile and, ultimately, a forced death sentence. These were not theoretical exercises in calm. They were dispatches from inside the experience of fear itself. The first thing the Stoics did when they felt afraid was something that strikes the modern mind as almost perverse. They sat down and thought about what they feared, in detail, with full deliberation. This practice had a name, premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, and it was not a gesture toward pessimism but toward precision, because the Stoics had observed something about the structure of fear that most people prefer to ignore. Fear, in its most disabling form, operates as ambush. It arrives without invitation, usually at a moment of relative quiet, and it carries with it the implicit claim that what it is showing you has never been considered before, that you are seeing the worst possibility for the first time. The Stoics understood that this claim is false, and that the mind can be trained to meet fear before fear arrives. Marcus Aurelius writes in Meditations 8.7 that a man can cut away many troubles which exist entirely in his own judgment, and that the practiced mind does not wait to be surprised by what it could have anticipated with clarity. The practice itself was deliberate and structured. Before a significant action, or at the start of a day, the Stoic would turn attention toward what might go wrong, not in the spirit of despair, but in the spirit of reconnaissance. Seneca, in his letters to Lucilius, letter 24, instructs Lucilius to rehearse misfortune in advance precisely because the mind that has already encountered an imagined version of the worst possible outcome is no longer ambushed by the real one when it comes, which means the fear that was meant to paralyze has already been partially metabolized. What this reveals is that premeditatio malorum is not about predicting the future but about refusing to grant fear the advantage of surprise. The Stoic who has already sat quietly with the thought of losing a position, a relationship, or even their life is a fundamentally different creature in the moment of actual threat than one who has spent their energy avoiding such thoughts. The preparation is the practice. But this raises a harder question. Once the Stoic had contemplated the worst, what did they do with the fear that remained? Once the Stoics had looked directly at what they feared, they applied what is perhaps their most structurally important philosophical instrument, the distinction between what is within our power and what is not. This distinction, which Epictetus places at the very opening of the Enchiridion, is so central to Stoic thought that every other practice depends upon it, and when applied to fear specifically, it performs a surgical operation on the experience. Epictetus writes in Enchiridion I.1 that some things are in our power and some are not, and that misery arises not from the things outside our power but from our judgment that they ought to be within it. Fear, examined through this lens, almost always contains a confusion of categories. When a person fears public humiliation, what they are fearing is not the event of humiliation itself, which is outside their control, but the meaning they have already decided to assign to it, which is entirely within the domain of their own judgment, and therefore within their power to revise. This is why Epictetus, in Discourses 2.1, can speak with such composure about physical danger, it is not that the danger does not exist, but that his fear of it is contingent on the belief that his body's safety is the supreme good, and he has already rejected that belief on philosophical grounds. The Stoics were not claiming that pain is pleasant or that loss is trivial. They were claiming that the terror attached to these events is a product of a prior valuation, a judgment about what matters most, and that judgment can be examined, questioned, and in time, revised. What this practice gives the person in fear is not comfort but agency. The Stoic does not say the danger has disappeared. The Stoic says, I can locate exactly what I have valued that is making this frightening, and I can ask whether that valuation is rational. This shift, from passive sufferer to active examiner, is itself a form of courage, because it requires the person to face not only what they fear but what they love and why. What Seneca said next, however, extends this practice into something even more intimate, and more demanding. There is a distinction the Stoics drew with remarkable psychological precision, one that anticipates by nearly 2 millennia what modern cognitive science has only recently begun to articulate, and it is the distinction between the physical sensation of fear and the narrative the mind immediately constructs around that sensation. For the Stoics, these were two entirely different events, and conflating them was one of the primary sources of unnecessary suffering. Marcus Aurelius addresses this in Meditations 6.13 when he writes that we should not disturb ourselves by picturing the full story of our life, that we should not let our imagination range over all the multitude of things which have happened and things which will happen, but instead confine ourselves to what is present. The sensation of fear, the quickened breath, the contracted chest, the narrowed attention, is a present physical event, and as such it is manageable. The story about what the sensation means, projected forward into an imagined future of total collapse, is where the Stoic refuses to follow. Seneca makes this point with characteristic directness in Letter 13 to Lucilius, writing that there are more things likely to frighten us than there are to crush us, and that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. This is not dismissal of real danger. Seneca was writing, in some of those very letters, as a man who knew that the Emperor Nero had already marked him for death, and he was killed by imperial order in 65 AD. His point was that fear rehearses its catastrophes with a thoroughness that reality rarely matches, and that the Stoic practice of staying with the actual sensation rather than following the narrative it generates is a discipline that must be practiced repeatedly and with honest self-examination. What this reveals, practically, is that the Stoic response to fear involves a moment of deliberate interruption, a refusal to follow the mind where it wants to go in the first second of alarm. This is not suppression. Suppression would mean denying the sensation exists. The Stoic acknowledges the sensation fully, names it, and then declines to add to it the catastrophic narration the untrained mind insists upon providing. The fourth and final practice, however, is in many ways the most demanding of all, because it asks not just for precision but for something closer to philosophy made physical. The final thing the Stoics did when they felt afraid was perhaps the one that most clearly distinguishes their philosophy from every modern framework that treats fear as something to be managed, reduced, or eventually removed. The Stoics acted. Not after the fear had passed, not once they had achieved sufficient calm, but within the fear itself, because they held a specific view of what virtue was that made action inseparable from character, regardless of inner conditions. For the Stoics, virtue, arrayed in the Greek tradition they inherited, was not a disposition toward pleasant states of mind. It was the active expression of reason in conduct, and it was the only thing they classified as an unconditional good. Marcus Aurelius returns to this idea throughout the Meditations, but in Book 7.54 he writes that wherever it is possible to live, it is also possible to live well, meaning that the conditions of virtue are never truly absent, even when everything else has been stripped away, because virtue is located in the quality of attention and choice brought to each moment, not in the comfort of the circumstances surrounding it. This is why Epictetus could speak of freedom from within legal slavery, and why Marcus Aurelius could write with philosophical composure from the edge of a military campaign in which thousands had died and more would follow. Neither man was pretending the circumstances were other than they were. Both men were demonstrating, by writing, by deciding, by acting with deliberate rationality in the midst of real fear, that the Stoic position is not that fear is conquered before action begins, but that action taken virtuously is itself the practice through which fear loses its authority over the self. The practical implication for the contemporary reader is this: the Stoic approach to fear is not a technique for achieving a fearless state that will eventually allow you to live well. It is a daily discipline of examining fear clearly, locating its philosophical structure, separating sensation from narrative, and then choosing the action most consistent with reason and virtue, not despite the fact that fear is present, but with full acknowledgement that it is. This, the Stoics insisted, is not the end of fear. It is the beginning of a life that fear no longer governs. Across these four practices, premeditatio malorum, the dichotomy of control, the separation of sensation from narrative, and a commitment to virtuous action within fear, the Stoics were developing a single coherent argument, that fear is not the enemy of the good life, but the terrain in which the good life is most clearly tested and most fully expressed. They did not promise that the practices would make fear disappear, because they believed that promise was both false and philosophically dishonest. What they offered instead was a method rigorous enough to be practiced, honest enough to survive real conditions, and demanding enough to require genuine philosophical commitment rather than occasional inspiration. The relevance of that method today lies not in its age but in the fact that the structure of human fear has not changed in 2,000 years, and neither, therefore, has the quality of response the Stoics prescribed. The Stoics wrote for themselves, but what they left behind survived 2,000 years for a reason. Subscribe, and we will keep exploring why.